Joe, did you know that a dream of mine that has gone unfulfilled in my life was to attend Harvard Business School?
I didn't know that. Knowing that your nickname was Slacker in college, I would think that that'd be the last dream you could ever have.
We technically changed my name my last year, mainly because I had a T-shirt that said Slacker on it,
Ah,
and made a terrible first impression when you walked into class the first day.
I
The
would think so.
professor sees that. You get targeted pretty quickly.
We did a tour of Stanford last summer because I have teenage boys. We happened to be there. My kids probably won't get in. I understand 3% do. And when I graduated from college, I went to Northeastern University in Boston. When I was done, I was done. I never wanted to go back to college. Touring a campus like Stanford, or I imagine Harvard, just at any age would make you want to go back.
Yeah, it's a fantastic school. I love their MBA program there because they do things a little bit different. It's not textbook based; it's case study based. So, Harvard MBA students, when they attend that school, first of all, the school pretty much requires that you have real world experience. Not 100%, but it's really hard to get in if you don't have any real world experience. They want people who have been out there in the field doing stuff. And the entire class structure itself is also based around case studies. So you end up with a group of people that you do these case studies with, and you study real life, real business scenarios, and go about figure out how to address those real world scenarios. It's a way of trying to replicate some of the things that they're going to actually experience when they leave Harvard Business School. So yeah, a few years after I graduated college, and had a job, and I thought, oh boy, that'd be a lot of fun to attend that, and I really liked the idea of it, but life got in the way, bad grades got in the way, and it never was something that I actually was able to pursue. I went so far as taking the GMAT, but I never actually applied. But I bring this up because, as you know, for the past 5 years, we've been working with Harvard at Quiet Light Brokerage. They have done what a lot of people that listen to this podcast know. They have really started to turn their focus towards entrepreneurship acquisition, or acquisitions and entrepreneurship and the combination. And they have a whole course that they teach on it, how to buy a small business and lead an entrepreneurial life through acquisitions. And for those 5 years, we've actually been working with them. They approached us to see if we could support their class with some supporting materials. And me being the closet Harvard fanboy that I am, was like, absolutely, that sounds really cool.
Excellent. Well, I'm excited to listen to this podcast. I know that they did some studies that show the people that go through this course and the success rate that they have. And it's really more about buying versus building, which is a little follow-up from almost what the podcast with Walker that you had. So I'm excited to hear it.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's some statistics in here. People ask us this all the time. What percentage of buyers are successful? Well, Harvard is actually tracking that. They're taking a look at the kids who go through the courses. And I shouldn't say kids. These guys are 30 years old with tons of experience. But they're looking at people who go through the courses, do an acquisition, and they're tracking to see how they're successful. Also in this episode, we talk about what they're teaching in the course, where they're guiding their students as far as how large of acquisitions they should be making, how to do the financing on these large acquisitions. So it's really chock full of a lot of information that's being taught at the highest levels at one of the leading institutions in the world.
And all of it, hopefully, an awful lot of it can be applied to the businesses that we're listing, because I'm going to just throw some numbers out there for those that haven't been to the website recently. We've got listings of really all shapes and sizes, but we've got a couple up there in that I think mine's under LOI, just under $9 million. Brian's got one at twice that amount. And then of course, anything from, a couple $100,000 up to that $18 million range. So these larger listings that take more funding from venture cap money or from a larger SBA loan are really becoming more prevalent. So I think everything that these guys talk about and the book that they published as well is going to be very helpful for the audience here today.
Absolutely. Let's get on to it. All right, Royce, how are you?
I'm great. It's a pleasure to be with you today, Mark. Thank you for organizing this.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm so glad to be able to actually finally talk to you and see you in person as well. We've been working together, I guess, sort of indirectly now for what, 4 or 5 years.
Exactly. And you've been a big help to our course at Harvard Business School. So we're very appreciative. I should start with a big thank you.
Well, it was always my dream when I was in college and then shortly after college to get my MBA at Harvard. I started looking at the GMAT, and I took prep courses for that, and then life happened, and I never got around to actually doing it. I actually talked to a Harvard recruiter at one point, sat down with them, and was going through that, but never did happen. So the fact that I actually get to participate in your guys' program is kind of like a dream of mine come true, that I get to actually work with you guys, at least indirectly, if not directly as well now. All right, so the Harvard program, how long have you guys had this Entrepreneurship Through Acquisition program?
The program is now in its 6th year, Mark, and for decades, Harvard has had a large program teaching people about traditional entrepreneurship, what I refer to as rubbing two sticks together to make fire, meaning going into startups. But about half a dozen years ago, we started teaching about the idea of buying an established, profitable company, usually from a retiring founder. And the idea has really created a lot of excitement at Harvard. About 30% of all of our MBA students take these courses to try out this as a potential career and learn about it, which makes us probably the largest elective course on campus.
Wow, that's fantastic. Now you do this, you do this, and one other professor, Richard, is it Ruback?
Yes, Richard Ruback. So Rick and I created the course, and we co-teach it, and it's really become the center of our professional activity, including following our students closely who go down this path. We stay very connected to them after they graduate from the program.
Yeah, that's great. So I want to make just one point about Harvard's MBA program. And again, I know this because I looked at potentially participating in this program, but you guys are a little bit different than other MBA programs in the way that you set up your courses, right? It's a lot of this case study sort of approach to everything. Is that right?
Yeah, that's
maybe
exactly
I should let you.
Right. I think the two differences in our programs from what most people think of as MBAs is, first, exactly what you said, which is we do not lecture, we do not have textbooks. The whole 2-year program is set up around cases, which are sort of short nonfiction business stories, and the discussion the faculty elicits about the decisions that are required to be made. And the second difference is our students typically come to us at about age 28 and graduate at age 30. So they have 6 or 7 years of mid-level, junior-level executive experience before coming into the classroom. So they're not kids. They're young professionals by the time they leave. I think those are the two distinctions I'd highlight about HBS.
Yeah, and one of the things I love about that, so one of the knocks against university, especially among the entrepreneurial community, is that a lot of entrepreneurs see university degrees and MBA degrees as being just almost wasted money, right? Because a lot of them have become successful. But what I love about your guys' program is the fact that you do require that experience. It's not textbook learning. It's actual looking at case studies, delving in deep into these actual cases, and amplifying a real world experience in the classroom setting.
Yeah, you're exactly right. That's the purpose of the case studies. In addition, the faculty is routinely engaged in the commercial world too, and is expected to bring that into the classroom. And we also utilize experts like yourself, Mark, and bring in work done by experts or even experts as guests into the classroom. So we try to stay very engaged with the practical commercial world. That's
great. That's absolutely great. I absolutely love that. Now, you guys have also, you and Rick have also put together a book. For those watching on YouTube, this is the book here, HBR Guide to Buying a Small Business.
Yes.
And you put this out 2 years ago, is that right?
Yeah, it's put out 2 years ago, and it's been very satisfying. Our goal was to produce a very practical handbook that walked people through each step in buying a smaller firm, and to try and reach beyond campus to the thousands of people who were thinking about it or wanting to do it, and give them something that's just immensely practical. And we've been very gratified. I think almost everyone who goes down this path ends up reading this book, and we get lots of comments that it's been helpful to them.
It's a really good book. I mean, I've thumbed through it before, and I've learned a lot in this industry by doing. And, that has its learning curve. Frankly, a book like this to start out would have been really, really useful in shortening that learning curve. So it's a really good book. And I assume that you can get this on the HBR website, correct?
The HBR website, and even more conveniently on Amazon. So it's just an easy thing to buy and a kind of quick, easy read as well.
It is a quick, easy read. There's large margins in there as well so that people can take notes alongside it, which is super, super helpful. So all you out there that are readers and soak up as much information, add this one to your list for sure. It's definitely one to add. You're getting some good information here. All right, so let's do this. Let's get into some of the material that you guys actually teach in the Entrepreneurship Through Acquisition course. What is the format and what is the structure or maybe what is the syllabus that you would look at for a typical, is it on a semester basis or is it a full year?
Yes, it's a full year course. And we start with an overview of the small firms market and sort of what are some of the management issues in running a small firm? How do you buy small firms? And we let people sort of figure out whether this is of interest to them generally. And then the course gets really, really practical. We kind of follow each step in a small firm acquisition, beginning with how do you source opportunities? How do you evaluate them? How do you do due diligence? How do you finance them? How do you negotiate the legal documents? And then we move into sort of the transition, because almost always after a firm is sold, the seller stays on for a while, at least part-time, teaching the new owner the ropes. And that is somewhere between 3 months and 12 months part-time for the seller, but it's a key part of making these purchases successful. So that's how we like to say we're following the arc of a small firm acquisition.
Yeah, that arc is something that our listeners are probably very familiar with. It's something that we have laid out on our site as well. I want to ask kind of a broader question with the popularity of your course. When people think about Harvard Business School, I think a lot of them think about graduates going into large financial firms, working in Boston, working in New York, and really kind of working with the Fortune 500s out there. Do you see a lot of your students now pursuing this more entrepreneurial path?
Yes, I do. And it's a great comment you made, because I do think Harvard is viewed that way. And one of the reasons this program is important is it's highlighting the fact that the business school makes a difference in ways that help ordinary Americans. In other words, we send our well-trained, smart, energetic graduates into cities all across the country, and they create jobs for regular people that make their lives better. I'll give you a quick example. One of our students, and this is very representative, is a woman named Jennifer Brous. She spent about 5 or 6 years as an engineer at a couple of leading manufacturing companies in the Midwest, came to HBS to be retrained as a general manager, fell in love with the idea of running her own company. Instead of getting a job out of HBS, she searched and bought a revenue cycle management company in the Pacific Northwest that essentially handles the billing for municipal ambulance services to insurance companies. Very specialized, complicated set of procedures. And she's grown the business from about 40 employees to 70 employees over the 3 years she's owned it. So it's been an enormously gratifying experience for her and a profitable one. It allowed an entrepreneur who wanted to retire to get his just reward and take cash out of the company. But it's also created a lot of good paying jobs in that mid-sized city. So kind of all the way around, it's exactly what our business school ought to be doing, we think. And that's what we're trying to do in this program.
Yeah, one thing I think that people don't understand about our industry, and when I talk to them for the first time, they often ask, who buys an online business? And one thing I've found is the synergy that exists between the bootstrappers and the startups, right? These guys that are really, really good at the hustle, and they can create something amazing out of practically nothing. And then they grow it to a certain size where it now needs management, and now it kind of enters into that phase 2. And a lot of these entrepreneurs don't want to do that because they don't want to be managers. They don't want to do that additional growth step of now managing lots of people.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. These businesses reach a transition point where once they needed someone who was not only energetic and smart, but knew the service they were providing incredibly well. And 15 or 20 years later, it's more about a trained manager who's gotten certain managerial skills. I'd also add to your comment, there's a life cycle to entrepreneurship. You know, the 60-year-old entrepreneur who's made a lot of money in their smaller firm, quite rightly might not want to work as hard as they did when they're 30 years old. And that's a very sensible decision. But the business may have a lot more potential in it in the hands of a 30 or 35-year-old who's willing to put in those 60 and 70-hour weeks. And that's another transition that makes sense for everybody.
Sure. I remember one client that I worked with, he was selling, we'll just say a durable good. I won't go into exactly what he was selling, but he was sourcing all of the inventory, putting it into a secondary garage, and then fulfilling all the orders on his own. I mean, he was working 45 hours a week and had really maxed out. And I asked him, I said, well, why are you selling? I mean, this business is growing. It's growing rapidly. Why not hire on some people and kind of expand to an actual warehouse? And his answer was probably the simplest, most logical answer I've ever heard. It was because I don't want to.
Yeah.
I don't want to manage people. I like doing this on my own, but that's the obvious next step.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And it's a very human thing. And the right answer is to put the business in the hands of someone who's going to maximize it. I think conversely, you know, from the perspective of a young entrepreneur through acquisition, I see this opportunity as so much lower risk than starting a company from scratch, because you're buying an established, proven, profitable business with a business model that really works and an owner who will sort of do an orderly transition with you. So it's a way to express entrepreneurial desire without taking the enormous risks of a startup or having to have some idea.
Right, absolutely. And I think this is something we talked about in a recent podcast, and that is the difference between buying versus building a business, and how you can get that leg up and get that initial startup so much faster. There's much less friction in working with something that's already established like that. So let's do this. Let's follow the arc of the deal that you had talked about a little bit earlier, and let's give the listeners here and the few viewers just a little flavor as to what this arc looks like, and maybe some of the things that you guys teach in the course as well. And let's start with this: how do you source your deals? I mean, this is a problem for so many buyers out there, right? I've talked to some buyers that are looking for a year and a half, 2 years for a good business, and the good ones, frankly, I know from experience, when we put something out that's good, we're going to get a letter of intent on that within 4 or 5 days.
Yes.
You know, and so it can be really tough. So what do you guys teach as far as sourcing deals and some of the tips that you would offer there?
Well, you're exactly right. You know, sourcing is immensely difficult in the small firm space. First of all, there are two paths people go down. One, which we certainly recommend, is dealing with the intermediary professionals in the small firm space. As you know, there are hundreds and hundreds of these across North America. And you're required to just do an enormous amount of outreach, because unlike, say, with real estate, where there are multiple listing services, confidentiality is extremely important to these owners of smaller firms. And so you only get to see these firms by establishing relationships with reputable intermediaries. So it's a great deal of work to establish that kind of dialogue. And then on top of that, once you have done that, the majority of businesses that are for sale are not high quality businesses. They're average at best, and a few of them are really good businesses. So it's an enormous outreach and sourcing process that frankly takes, from the time someone starts sourcing to the time they close, the average time is about 18 months to find a good quality business, negotiate, diligence it, and close it. So, and that's 18 months of full-time work. Probably the question I get asked most often by aspiring entrepreneurs through acquisition is this something I could do part-time? Because it would be so great to do it part-time, right? You could keep a full-time job, earn income, and you imagine you might be able to do it nights and weekends, like rebuilding an old car or refinishing a basement. But the truth is, I've never seen anyone do this part-time. It is, for everyone who goes down this road, it is a demanding full-time job to source, evaluate, diligence, negotiate, and it takes an average of 18 months. So it's hard.
What are some ways, in your opinion, that people can speed that up if they're really anxious to get going? Like they're working a corporate job right now and they want to get out of that corporate job. Do you have any tips on how they can speed that up?
Yes. We we see that a lot, that people have worked in a corporate job, they just find it unsatisfying, and they want the professional independence that comes with this kind of entrepreneurship. You know, it's hard to make this go faster. I've seen people close quickly because we've seen scores and scores of people do this. I've seen people buy businesses in as little as 5 or 6 months. But I have to say my conclusion after years of doing this is that those are just flukes. You know, that in the same way that the person who struggles on for 2 years is a fluke, that you get some outliers, but it's just really hard to make the process go faster. And one reason for that is, of those 18 months, probably the last 4 months are spent in that deal you'll close on. You know, signing the LOI, diligence, financing, closing. So really, you're talking about a little over a year of searching before you finally get to that deal that makes. I wish I could hurry up this process, but it's one of the reasons that I suppose the space hasn't been bid up or overcrowded, is that someone has to really want this.
Sure. And I think that's really good advice. You're right. There's some luck of the draw, right? There's just some pure luck of the draw. I talked to one person years ago. I was when we first tried to do the podcast, and it didn't really work. But I talked to one buyer who said that he was ready for that sort of 18-month time period.
Yes.
And within 2 months, something just ran across his desk and it was perfect.
Yes.
But he didn't have the financing lined up for it. And so he had to let it go.
Yes.
But it was that luck of the draw. It came to him perfectly right way. If he was ready, he would have been able to move on it. That actually leads well to my next question, which is the financing. What are you guys advising your students, and what are you seeing them actually do in terms of financing some of these deals?
Yeah. So the typical acquisition is financed with about 2/3 debt and 1/3 equity. And let me deal with each of those. On the debt side, in the small firms marketplace, it is almost universal for the sellers to take back some amount of seller paper. Usually 20 to 25% of the purchase price is taken back in what's on average a 4 or 5 year subordinated note. There are a few exceptions to this, but it's a very large percentage of the transactions. And about 45% on average of the transaction is funded by a senior bank loan. And this comes in 2 flavors. One is just a regular way commercial bank loan. They'll typically finance a little under half of the deal, and it'll be repaid over 5 to 7 years, usually from a local or regional bank, with the first candidate being a bank that the company has an existing relationship with. The second path is the Small Business Administration has a terrific program called the 7A program. I'm sure you're familiar with this. It's administered through banks. Most of the banks that lend commercial loans also will do a 7A guaranteed loan. It is a wonderful loan product because they will lend against businesses that have no tangible assets, service businesses that just have cash flow. They'll lend up to 80% of the business. They'll lend over 10 years. There are no covenants. It's a very, very attractive loan, with the single exception that you are required to sign a personal guarantee on it. So it's something for very thoughtful consideration by the entrepreneur. But those are the 2 sources of debt. And as I said, with the seller debt, make up about 2/3 of the purchase price. 1/3 is usually raised from friends and family. And most common is that these prospective entrepreneurs will go around and raise money in $100,000 here, $200,000 here, from anywhere from 6 to 15 individuals, and they will cut a deal to divide the prospective profits between their investor group and themselves. Because a typical small business that we see, when we talk about a small business, we're talking about a company with $1 to $2 million of EBITDA that might sell for 5 times EBITDA, or $10 million, of which $3 million might be equity. And so it's not that difficult to raise that amount of equity by passing the hat.
Yeah, I think one thing that a lot of our buyers that come into us feel is that they can't reach that level of a transaction, right? Mm-hmm. They can't reach that $10 million acquisition. And so they start out a lot with these $200,000, $300,000 businesses, and then they find that they're effectively buying a job.
Yes.
So it seems like you guys are really pushing a lot of your students to think a little bit bigger than that, and to be buying a business.
Yes.
As it were.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think when you get to a very small business and you're the entrepreneur, you're showing up every day to process out that day's work. That's that $200,000 EBITDA business. When the business gets to be $1 million, you usually have some department heads who report up to you, and you're coming in thinking about the week's objectives or maybe the month's objectives. And then when you get up to a business with, say, $2 million in EBITDA, you're really managing a little further out than that, so that the jobs are very different along the way. And so that we tend to point our potential entrepreneurs toward the larger end of that spectrum, but entrepreneurship can surely be expressed anywhere along the spectrum.
Yeah, I think a big phrase that we hear all the time in our space is work on your business rather than in your business. And it's a transition point for a lot of people, but it seems like you guys are really pushing people to start with a business that you would work on, because some of that infrastructure is going to exist already.
Yes, I think that's right. That is our goal, but we recognize that people have different resources, including experience in managing and opportunity to access capital.
Right. Do you have any tips for people that might be considering reaching out to friends and family? How do you get over some of the discomfort maybe with asking friends or family for investments?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. So I do have some recommendations. I think the first recommendation is just a psychological one, which is when you go to someone to ask them for an investment, you really have to make yourself feel that you're not asking for a favor. It's not like you're asking for a personal loan. You're presenting an opportunity to that person, and it's one you believe in so sincerely that you're going to dedicate the next 5 or 7 or 8 years of your life to it. So it's very important to really be in that psychological headspace. My second recommendation is to actually start with the people who know you best, because they're going to be really inclined, if they respect you and like you, to line up behind you. And then it's going to make it easier to go to people who know you less well. And my third recommendation is the time to approach people for investing is when you start your search. It's not when you find your company, because what you want to do is collect a group of people who might be interested in investing and update them across the year or year and a half that you're searching. Because when you do this, it allows them to get to know you better. It shows them that you have lots of energy. It shows them your street smarts. You talk to them about deals you looked at but ended up rejecting, which gives them a sense of your high quality standards. So when you finally approach them with a deal in hand, they've been expecting this. And now you're making one sale, not two. You've sort of sold them on the idea that you're a hardworking, street smart entrepreneur who's being highly selective. And now you're simply selling them on the merits of the business. So for that reason, it's tremendously important to approach them early and get them to follow you. It's also a much more comfortable discussion than showing up with a deal in hand, because you're able to say, look, if you're sincerely interested in this, I'll make the investment in informing you about my journey, and you'll have plenty of time to decide. It takes a lot of pressure out of that discussion.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, please.
Just one more thing about this, which is when you approach the types of people I see our entrepreneurs approaching, and here you should think about people who are partners in law firms, entrepreneurs of their own small businesses. These people don't have, while they're wealthy people by normal standards, they don't have the resources to invest in private equity funds. They can't stroke a check for $2 million or $5 million that a private equity fund would expect. So when you come to them with the opportunity to participate in what essentially is a private equity investment, it's very additive to them. It's not an opportunity they see every day to make the kind of returns you can make buying a private business.
Yeah, and I think tons of really good information in there. You're right. As far as that relationship is concerned, when you're asking somebody for money, building that relationship over time makes that discussion a little bit easier, and also gives you the flexibility. That example I brought up of the guy who started his search and didn't have his funding lined up in advance, he actually gave me that exact same point. He said, had I been having these conversations with friends and family in advance, I would have been able to do this deal very, very quickly. But it was just way too much for him to try and cobble together an investment group within a few weeks. These things don't happen over weeks; they happen over months and even a year.
Absolutely. And as you know from your own professional experience, in those last 8 weeks before closing, the entrepreneur is sort of fighting on multiple directions, right? He's dealing with a lender, he's dealing with the lawyers on a purchase agreement, he's finishing his due diligence, he's dealing with investors. You just don't have time to sort of raise investment capital from scratch.
That's great. All right, let's talk a little bit about the transition stuff, and then we're going to be rounding out as far as our time here is concerned. There's stuff obviously that happens in between. We've talked about ways to search for a company and source those deals. It can take about 18 months on average, depending on a little bit of the luck of the draw. Talked a little bit about the financing, some of the vehicles there. So let's assume now that you find that business, you find the good opportunity, you've gone through the negotiation, and I know there's a lot that we could talk about just through the negotiation stage, but I want to talk a little bit about the transition period and plan. How important do you think it is to keep previous employees, previous key people, previous owners on staff? And what other elements do you think are really, really kind of, you should almost always take these steps in a transition?
The advice I give entrepreneurs through acquisition is twofold. First, the first and most important advice I give them is, in your first 6 months, don't make any important changes. You'll have lots and lots of decisions to make, but if an important change is one that's expensive or hard to reverse, hold off on that, because you will be a different person at the end of 6 months than you are on the day you walk into that company. And if it's the kind of enduring, profitable business we hope people will buy, it certainly can wait on these decisions. I also find that transition periods can be relatively short. 3 to 6 months is usually all you need in a transition period, with some occasional access to the seller after that. By the way, this is another reason why having a seller subordinated loan is important, because you want the seller to be financially on side with you after the purchase. But that seller is going to introduce you to his or her important clients. They're going to make an endorsement of you as the person they're entrusting the business to. They're going to answer a lot of process and historical questions that in a small company aren't written down in any textbook. But for most of these businesses, that transition can take place well over 3 to 6 months. And after all, you want to buy a business that is not so centered on the selling entrepreneur that transferring it isn't easy. In other words, if that transfer is really, really, really hard, that might not be a business that you want to buy. So I think that's a consideration you want to have before you step in and commit to the business. But a 3 to 6 month transition I've seen works pretty well. By the way, it might be helpful, as long as we're sort of at this point in the arc of buying a small business, if I shared a little data we collected over the years about success in this path.
That was my next question, so perfect timing. Okay. Yes, let's go there.
Well, we've had the chance to survey a fairly large number of entrepreneurs through acquisition, and what we found over the 6 years that we've been doing this is, of the people who embark on a full-time search to buy a company, about 70 to 80% of them end up acquiring a company and closing on it, and about 20 to 25% try it, give up, and go back and get jobs that are pretty much like the jobs that they had before they embarked on this path. Of course, they've spent a year to a year and a half doing this, and that hasn't been a profitable use of time except in terms of experience, but they go back and get a job that tends to look like what they had. 3/4 of them end up closing on a company. Now, then we turn to the question of, is this successful? It's harder to get that data because these are all private companies. But over the years, Rick and I have had the benefit of actually getting some very active investors in these type of small firms to share with us their financial history of all their investments. And we've collected about 60 different transactions made by a handful of professional investors. And what we found is that approximately 80% of those are profitable and about 20% are unprofitable, which is a really high rate of investment success. I mean, if you think about investing in the stock market and do you get 4 out of 5 investments profitable, I mean, that would be a tremendous bar of success to have. And of the investments that are made, both winners and losers, the average rate of return to the investors has been about 22% annually. which is also a very high return, but consistent with what you would expect in private equity investments. Very importantly, these results don't tell any specific individual what their results are going to be. I mean, you could find a company or not find a company, you could be successful or not successful, but I think it suggests that the area is a reasonably fruitful area to try and achieve success in. That's what I take away from the data.
That's really good. And I get these questions all the time. So actually now I have something to go back to people with. This is great. I am curious on the 20% that are not successful. Do you guys have any data as to what's leading to it not being profitable?
Yeah. Well, of course, there's always a huge element of chance, as you and I have talked about earlier in this. But yes, I think that there is a single most common contributor to success and non-success in the search. And that is when an entrepreneur through acquisition starts searching on their very first day, looking at their very first prospective deal, they quite rightly set their standards unbelievably high. In other words, nothing would get them to buy the first company they see because they want to learn what's available in the market. And as they see more and more companies, they gradually bring down their standards into what normal market is for a small company. In other words, they start to say, okay, I'm going to raise the price I offer into the range that companies transact at. I'm not going to require that this company be absolutely perfect. It's okay that it has some flaws like every company. And their quality standard gradually moves to market. How quickly they are able to learn what a small company really looks like determines how successful they're going to be. Some people never get there. Some people it takes a year to get there. Some people can do it in 60 to 90 days, and they have a much better chance of buying a company in the time period. By the way, Mark, just as an aside, the same thing is going on with sellers, as I'm sure you'd recognize. That person who owned a business for 30 years enters the market with a price expectation that is well above market. And as they get feedback from the market, they're gradually bringing their expectations down to market, or they're leaving the market. And what you're looking for is the collision between those two forces entering the zone at the same time. But that speed of learning is the difference between being a highly likely to succeed entrepreneur through acquisition and not.
A lot of the work that we do at Quiet Life Brokerage with sellers is that sphere of expectations. Right.
Exactly.
And trying to bring them to that place, or more importantly, I guess, advising them to only enter into the marketplace when their expectations have moved, because it's got to happen. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's a delicate conversation, as I'm sure you've experienced many times.
It is, you know, and we try to be very just blunt with people. My personal background is before I started Quiet Life Brokerage, I got really good advice from an intermediary who told me to wait. But then when I actually went to market with them, they actually blew my expectations up higher. And when I got those first offers, and I tell people the marketplace is brutally honest. You know, I might be nice, the marketplace isn't. It'll
Yes.
just be honest and blunt. And when I got those first few offers, it was like a punch to the gut. I'm like, wow, okay, I'm not even in the same neighborhood of what you guys are talking about. All right, I want to leave with this question. If you were to be talking to a potential buyer and you were to give them, you know, one or two just solid pieces of advice, and that's all you had time to be able to give them because that's all the time we have left, what would you tell them?
I would tell them to look for an established, slow-growing, slow-changing company, because for a first-time entrepreneur, having an enduringly profitable business is the most important thing. It will allow them to make the kind of mistakes a first-time CEO makes and still be successful. Sometimes people are enamored by fast growth, but fast growth means change, competition, new customers. So something that's established and slow-growing and proven is what they want to look for. And it's okay that it isn't a, quote, boring type business. You'll find plenty of excitement as being a CEO. That would be my number one piece of advice to a potential buyer.
Well, I wish I had talked to you before I did my first acquisition, because that would have been helpful. Right. Royce, thank you so much for coming on here. Again, I've been completely enamored working with Harvard Business School over the past several years. I hope that we can continue to work with you guys. And someday, you know, maybe if it works out for you guys to be able to come out there as well. and meet you guys in person. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, and we're very grateful for your participation. Take care.
Absolutely.